Hi, and welcome to the Good Lawyers Gone Bad podcast. My name is Stuart Teicher. Now, you'll notice that this podcast episode is episode number 1. But if you look at the podcast website, you'll see that there's already an episode number 1 that was posted before this episode number 1. And, well, they're basically both episode number 1. The only difference is I didn't really like the quality of the recording on the original first episode, so I re-recorded it. So if you've already heard episode number 1, well, then you can skip this one and go to the next one. But if this is your first time with me, well, then enjoy this better quality recording of episode number 1. I know a little bit about Newark, New Jersey. I'm from New Jersey, so I have a pretty good understanding of my home state's different cities. And Newark happens to be a city that's bigger than most. It's probably bigger than the city in whatever neck of the woods you're from, because it happens to be that big. I mean, it's home to the New Jersey Symphony, it's home to the NHL's New Jersey Devils, but because it's an area that sits almost literally in the shadow of New York City, it's never quite received the worldwide respect that it deserves as a large metropolitan area. The truth is, Newark is probably best known for being a tough place. But even that description is underselling reality. Newark is a tough place that's still reeling from its turbulent history. In the mid-1960s, civil rights activists were warning that American cities were veritable powder kegs. The conflict between black residents and white police officers was so intense that the slightest spark between the groups was likely to cause an eruption. During the summer of 1967, that's exactly what happened. Conflicts between police and black residents erupted in riots in several different cities throughout the United States. Among the most notable was Newark, New Jersey. There, a black cab driver was beaten by 2 white police officers after being stopped for a traffic violation. 5 days of rioting ensued, during which 26 people died, over 700 were injured, and 1,400 people were arrested. More than $10 million of damage was caused, and entire blocks within the cities were burned down to the ground. Now, whites didn't start moving out of the city after the riots. That began when Eisenhower created the interstate highway system. That's when the suburbs became a thing, and that's what caused a lot of people to start moving out of the cities. But the strife in the summer of 1967 certainly exacerbated it. It was around that time that Newark, New Jersey began a decades-long period of struggle. Many New York-adjacent cities that were once downtrodden have had a rebirth. Jersey City is literally across the Hudson River from Manhattan. It's got gleaming skyscrapers. Hoboken's also a commuter town now to New York City. It's considered a hip place for young people to live. And while Newark has certainly come a long way since the days of the riots, quite frankly, it hasn't come as far as you'd expect. That's because the 1967 riots have become part of Newark's DNA. The residual tension from those tough times still comes to the forefront whenever anyone reports on criminal justice matters in Newark. To this day, the 1967 riots are part of that conversation. And many parts of Newark are still considered to be dangerous places. It's against that backdrop that we find a guy named William Baskerville. I can't tell you too much about Mr. Baskerville. I don't know if he had hobbies. I don't know what kind of music he liked. I don't know if he was a sports fan. What I do know, however, is that William Baskerville sold drugs on the streets of Newark in the early 2000s. Baskerville wasn't some solo dealer. He was part of a well-known crew. The gang was run by his cousin, the locally infamous Hakeem Curry. Curry went by the street name E.T. Hawk, and he was Newark's most well-known cocaine dealer at the time. One of Baskerville's buyers was a guy named Chemo Deshawn McCrae. Now, Chemo must have been happy with Baskerville's product because he bought drugs from Baskerville multiple times in March and October of 2003. What Baskerville didn't know, however, was that he was selling drugs to a convicted felon who just happened to be acting as an informant. That's right, Chemo Deshaun McCrae was working for the FBI. I don't think it's so surprising for me to say that being an FBI informant can be detrimental to one's life. Once your cover is busted, your life is in danger. Chemo McCrae knew that better than anyone. Earlier that year, Chemo received what the FBI considered a legitimate threat to his life, and they offered Chemo a place in federal witness protection. Chemo, however, was not interested. Now, law enforcement wasn't pleased with that because a dead informant is no informant. And that's probably why the FBI was motivated to talk Chemo into some sort of compromise. Eventually, the two of them made a deal. Instead of entering formal witness protection, Chemo agreed to live in a hotel paid for by the FBI. But that only lasted a little while because Chemo soon left the hotel and bounced around between the homes of friends and family. Quite frankly, Chemo should have been thankful that the FBI offered any assistance at all. Heck, he probably should have been thankful that the Bureau was even still talking to him. That's because the Federal Bureau of Investigation was pissed with Chemo McCrae. It all went back to an incident in 2003. That's when the FBI was investigating two people, and Chemo provided some vital information on the matter. He told the FBI that the two people were involved in a conspiracy. The only problem was they weren't involved in a conspiracy. And what made it particularly infuriating for the FBI was that their informant, Chemo McCrae, well, he knew it. But why did Chemo lie? We don't know. And the truth is, it's not important. What is important is that in the world of undercover operations, there aren't many things more useless than an informant who lies. So Chemo's relationship with the Bureau was on thin ice. Well, despite the fact that Chemo's relationship with the FBI had cooled, his undercover work was still providing some hot tips. And some of those tips were good enough to get the aforementioned William Baskerville arrested. After selling drugs to Chemo on 8 different occasions, the feds picked up Baskerville on drug charges. Baskerville was facing significant charges, a ton of jail time, and he needed a lawyer. So he retained an attorney named Paul Berggren. It made perfect sense that an accused drug dealer and gang member like William Baskerville in Newark, New Jersey, would choose Paul Berggren as his defense lawyer. Berggren was both well-versed in criminal law, and he also had a reputation around town. But was that reputation a good one or a bad one? Well, it depended who you asked. The son of a Brooklyn police officer, Paul Berggren served as a major in the Army and as a member of the elite 75th Ranger Regiment. He cut his legal teeth first as a prosecutor at the New Jersey state level in Essex County, and then as a prosecutor with the United States Attorney's Office. After years on the prosecution side acquiring a tremendous amount of trial experience, he did what many prosecutors do. He switched teams. He started representing criminal defendants. I guess it might not be fair to simply say that Berggren just kind of decided to move over to criminal defense. That's because to a certain extent he was kind of pushed out. You see, he angered his federal colleagues. Berggren's problems at the United States Attorney's Office seemed to stem from an incident where Berggren, now remember, he was a prosecutor at that office, Berggren testified at a criminal trial on behalf of 2 defendants. Berggren took that unusual position because the defendants were people he knew. The U.S. Attorney's Office was pursuing corruption charges against a couple of investigators from Essex County, and it seems that Berggren knew those guys from his days at the Essex County Prosecutor's Office. So, out of loyalty to the people he knew, Berggren decided to stand up for them at trial. That, as you could imagine, pissed off some of his prosecutor colleagues. It made them so mad that after Berggren testified, his co-workers at the U.S. Attorney's Office made his life very difficult, and he eventually quit. There's no way to know whether Paul Berggren's conflict with his colleagues at the U.S. Attorney's Office created a change in Berggren's approach to lawyering. It might have been the inciting incident that formed his approach to representing criminal defendants. Of course, for all we know, Berggren could have already been developing deep-set ideals about what it meant to be a lawyer in the criminal field. Or maybe it's like some alcoholics. For some, the disease is inside a person. But even for those genetically predisposed individuals, the disease often doesn't rear its head until some environmental factor or occurrence switches it on. Whatever the motivation, Paul Berggren had a relatively unique way of practicing criminal law. He was, shall we say, overly zealous. Paul Berggren had everything one needed for a successful career as a criminal defense lawyer. He had the credentials, the experience, and the swagger. And he was known for that swagger. When Paul Berggren showed up someplace, he most likely looked super cool. He probably pulled up in his Bentley. He emerged from that luxury vehicle with slick back hair. He had a pencil-thin mustache, and he was most likely wearing a great suit. Berggren was barrel-chested. He retained the impressive physique he developed during his former life as an amateur boxer. And that build certainly added to his mystique as a fighter in the courtroom. But Berggren's abilities extended beyond the courtroom. Paul Berggren knew the street. Paul Berggren knew the street, Paul Berggren knew the players, and Paul Berggren knew how to use the players to work the street. Throughout his career, there were allegations that he behaved in his practice like his clients behaved on that street. There were allegations about that overly zealous approach in numerous articles written about the man. There were claims that he had tampered with juries. There was a story that he coached a small child to lie on the stand. There were claims that he cheated on his wife with multiple women and had a longtime mistress. And then there was alleged drug use as well. So Paul Berggren was a legend in the world of Newark criminal defense. He was famous or infamous, and that depended upon which side of the law you sat. He had a big name, a big ego, and he put all of that bigness into a big office in the city. Paul Berggren's law firm was located in a large 19th floor suite in 50 Park Place, an impressive building in the heart of Newark. For all those reasons, criminal defendants surely loved Paul Berggren. And that's probably why his practice attracted a variety of high-profile people and cases. Berggren represented mafiosos like Angelo the Horn Prisco, a player in the Genovese crime family. He also represented drug lords. He represented rap stars like Lil' Kim, Queen Latifah, and Naughty by Nature. He even represented soldiers who were accused of human rights abuses at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. It might have been his lawyering style that attracted those kinds of people, but it was more likely his personality. The New York Times described him as having a penchant for bluster and flamboyance. That larger-than-life persona probably irked his former colleagues at the United States Attorney's Office. But their concern about Paul Berggren was more than skin deep. The government believed that Berggren's practice had devolved into a mess of criminality. Word on the street was that after years of practice, he had become house counsel for gangs and that he used his criminal defense practice as an elaborate front for all kinds of criminality. But even though that chatter attracted the attention of law enforcement over the years, none of it stuck. For a long time, the closest the law ever got to Paul Berggren was in 2005. During that year, prosecutors were apparently close to getting an indictment against the lawyer, but the case against him was blown when some evidence was mishandled. In the early 2000s, however, prosecutors started taking a much closer look at Berggren's practice. And they started to notice something strange in Berggren's cases. An alarming number of witnesses in the matters Berggren worked on either changed their stories or turned up dead. Plus, word on the street was that Berggren had taken control of a Manhattan escort service. So the powers that be started an investigation into the lawyer. What they found was concerning, to say the least. Consider the case of Vicente Estevez. In May of 2008, Vicente Estevez was in a bind. He was facing drug charges in Monmouth County, New Jersey, and those charges were so serious that they could put him away for an awful long time. Luckily, Estevez had Paul Berggren as his counsel, a lawyer who was prepared to go the distance. According to the FBI archives, here's what Berggren was alleged to have done. Estevez was facing drug trafficking charges, and the prosecution had some key witnesses that would sink Estevez if they testified. The goal, therefore, was to get them not to testify. How could Berggren get them not to testify? Well, if Berggren tried to speak with one of those potential witnesses, maybe he could convince them to refrain from testifying. Of course, there's one other option. Why not just kill them? I mean, that would do the trick, right? If the witnesses could be eliminated, Berggren's client would be out of jail, and he'd be able to get back to his business of drug trafficking. So Berggren, his client, and another guy hired a hitman. Berggren traveled to Chicago and took a meeting with a guy named Oscar Cordova. According to the FBI, Berggren wanted Cordova to kill witnesses that could testify against Vicente Estevez. 3 people, it seems, needed to vanish. One of those people was someone called Junior the Panamanian. Berggren believed that Junior the Panamanian was a government informant, and he was recorded saying that he's the fucking rat he wanted murdered. Berggren spoke with the hitman several times. He got pretty detailed in his direction about the deed. Berggren said, "I got it all figured out." He told the hitman to wear a ski mask to make it look like a robbery, and under no circumstances, he directed, could it look like a hit. To Berggren and the Estevez crew, everything probably seemed to be moving along nicely. But Berggren's plot to kill the witnesses against Estevez was actually doomed from the start. It wasn't because of a logistical issue or anything like that. It was because the hitman, Oscar Cordova, wasn't really a hitman. He was a government informant. Cordova was wearing a wire during his meetings with Berggren, and for months the witness recorded conversations as Berggren tried to hire Cordova to commit murder. That's how the FBI learned that Berggren and another accomplice schemed to locate and kill a number of witnesses that they believed intended to cooperate with the prosecution and testify against Estevez. During their investigation, the government learned much more about Paul Berggren. In addition to witness tampering, they claim he operated a cocaine trafficking business right out of his office. They later brought evidence at trial that showed he was connecting cocaine buyers with their suppliers and that he personally supplied clients with cocaine from his law office. According to the government, Berggren was operating a veritable crime ring. They claimed that he was initiating drug sales out of his law office, facilitating prostitution, meeting with gangs to discuss the elimination of witnesses, and hiring contract killers for that purpose. But there was more. The government also claimed that Berggren was operating a mortgage fraud scheme. According to the FBI, here's how the scam worked. Berggren would find a property in Essex County, New Jersey, and he'd make an application to get financing for that property. But Berggren would lie about the key details in that application. He'd inflate both the value of the property and the creditworthiness of the potential borrowers. By using those tactics, Berggren was able to get $1.1 million worth of loans. And oh, by the way, he defaulted on all of those loans. Which brings us back to Berggren's client, William Baskerville, the guy who was looking at life in prison after selling drugs to Chemo McRae. Yeah, Baskerville didn't just retain Paul Berggren because of his reputation. Berggren was the personal lawyer for the E.T. Hock drug running organization. So when one of Hock's crew got pinched, it was Berggren who came to the rescue. So that included representing William Baskerville. Eventually, Baskerville's team learned that Chemo McRae was the key prosecution witness, and when they did, they made it known. About a month after William Baskerville was arrested, Chemo was walking down South Orange Avenue in Newark when a burgundy Chevy Impala sneaked up alongside of him. As the car passed, Chemo saw Rakeem Baskerville, William's brother, inside the vehicle. Rakeem stared Chemo down as the car inched by. Message sent and message received. Chemo was the narc, and everybody knew it. Chemo, it seems, realized his life was in danger. He went back to the FBI and asked for witness protection. The FBI, however, probably wasn't too interested in helping an unreliable informant who recently screwed the Bureau on a case. But Chemo wasn't completely ostracized. He did have some support at the FBI. Chemo's handler, Special Agent Sean Brokos, believed that the FBI owed it to Chemo to keep him safe. She started the process of getting approval from her bosses to get Chemo into protection. She even floated the idea of having Chemo arrested in order to protect him. She put that process in motion, but it would take some time to sort everything out. Meanwhile, Baskerville was in a serious bind. McCrae's testimony would put him behind bars for life. So, his crew sprung into action. Paul Berggren convened a meeting with E.T. Hawk and the other members of his gang. He confirmed that Baskerville was probably going to spend the rest of his life behind bars on narcotics charges if Chemo testified. But Berggren then allegedly told them how Baskerville could be spared. Berggren could spring Baskerville, he explained, if someone offed the witness, Chemo McCrae. If Chemo were dead, Baskerville's chances of avoiding jail time increased dramatically. When the crew disbanded from that meeting, Berggren made things clear. On their way out of the door, he told the group to remember, quote, "No Chemo, no case." On March 3rd, Chemo McCrae was once again walking down South Orange Avenue in Newark, New Jersey. He must not have sensed that he was being followed. A guy named Anthony Young was not too far behind. Chemo didn't realize that Young was tailing him, and he also didn't know that Young was very recently made $15,000 richer. All he had to do to earn that money was find Chemo McCrae. As Chemo McCrae crossed the intersection of South Orange Avenue and 19th Street, Anthony Young sneaked up behind Chemo and shot him in the back of the head 3 times. That night, FBI Special Agent Sean Brokos was in her office when she heard the police radio squawking. Newark police officers were being dispatched to South Orange Avenue at 19th Street for a homicide. Maybe it was cop intuition that caused her to perk up when she heard that particular call. If it was, that intuition would have been right. Minutes later, her phone rang. It was Chemo McCrae's mother. She was in a panic. Brokos quickly reached out to some police force task members, and they confirmed that the victim was Chemo McCrae. Brokos must have felt terrible because she went right to the scene after learning that Chemo had been killed. There, she filled in local police about what probably happened. She told a detective that McCrae was her informant, and he was probably killed as a result. If Brokos was indeed feeling guilty about McCrae's death, she wasn't getting any sympathy from Chemo's family. Chemo's stepfather, Johnny Davis, blamed her for Chemo's death. He was an informant, Davis insisted, and Brokos should have protected him. Eventually, Baskerville and Young were picked up for Chemo's murder. Young pled guilty before trial and testified against Baskerville, and Baskerville got life in prison. Young was sentenced to 30 years. Also arrested was their lawyer, Paul Berggren. Berggren had to know he was in the feds' crosshairs. Throughout the years, the government had been trying to get him on numerous charges, but they never stuck. So it's almost incredible that he would continue to do all those bad things, knowing all the while that he was likely under government surveillance. It was just so risky. Then again, if he wasn't reckless, we wouldn't be talking about him right now. After being arrested, Berggren awaited trial in Brooklyn's Metropolitan Detention Center, a place that housed a series of notable residents at one time or another, including the fallen cryptocurrency king Sam Bankman-Fried, better known by his initials SBF, Vincent Basciano, boss of the Bonanno crime family, and rapper Tekashi 6ix9ine. But Berggren didn't get any respite while behind bars. His alleged significant crime ring caused him headaches while he was in jail. The government feared that he'd behave in jail just like he behaved on the outside, and as a result, he spent much of his time awaiting trial in solitary confinement. Why do lawyers like Paul Berggren float off into such an incredible abyss? One theory harkens back to corruption. Let's put it this way. The city of Newark had a reputation for having a less than above board law enforcement apparatus. It's a reputation that extends all the way back to those 67 riots, and it continues in many circles to this day. It's not hard to find a magazine article from just about any era that talks about the alleged corruption among the police in Newark, New Jersey. Of course, many of those articles are based on anecdotal information, so it's tough to say whether there are any more bad apples in Newark these days than anywhere else. Regardless, the argument goes that corruption breeds corruption. So maybe Paul Berggren was simply a product of the community where he worked. It's possible. Some people say that when people think that corrupt activity is acceptable, they're likely to act that way as well. But even if the concept has legs, it doesn't explain why a defense lawyer would go so far over to the dark side. I mean, the things that Berggren was charged with, you're not talking about a lie here and there. It was full-fledged organized criminal activity. You can't blame that on something like Malcolm Gladwell's power of context. There are hundreds of criminal defense lawyers in Essex County, and the overwhelming majority of them, well, they don't operate crime rings out of their office. Here's my theory, and I preface this by saying I'm not talking about Paul Berggren in particular, and that I have absolutely no formal training which allows me to be so definitive in my analysis. It's just my theory. And my theory is that lawyers who go so far overboard, and I'm going to use a phrase that's popular these days, they're just built different. The lawyers we talk about on this podcast, the lawyers who were once good but have gone bad, they're all built different. And I don't mean that in a good way. These lawyers don't just push the envelope a little bit. They're not purposefully ignoring a conflict or pretending like they didn't see a court order. They're engaging in extremely risky behavior where they both know that there is a high chance they're going to be caught, and they know that the penalties will be severe. It's not just bad decisions, it's reckless. It's insanely reckless. That's why I think these lawyers are just like addicts. They're adrenaline junkies. They need to push. The bad acts seem to fuel them. They can't stop themselves from doing these things, and once they take that first step, like addicts, the behavior progressively gets worse. And it really is an addiction. An article post on the website verywell.com explained, quote, a 2016 study of so-called adrenaline junkies, such as rock climbers, found that regular climbers experience frequent and intense craving states and negative effects when they stopped climbing, similar to individuals with substance use disorders. The adrenaline is like a drug for these lawyers, and it fuels their insanely reckless behavior. As for Paul Berggren, he was charged with directing the Baskerville crew to murder Kimo McRae. Interestingly, in Berggren's 2009 trial, the evidence didn't pan out, and in November of 2011, there was a hung jury. But the prosecution wasn't going down so easily. The government retried Berggren in 2013 and added the charges for the Estevez hitman matter. Berggren had supporting counsel, but essentially he represented himself. Whenever a defendant represents themselves, there's a potential for a circus atmosphere. When a lawyer represents themselves, well, that's almost guaranteed. As for his adversary, prosecutor Paul Fishman was no stranger to Berggren. The two had toiled alongside one another in Berggren's former life when he worked for the U.S. Attorney's Office. Berggren mounted a multifaceted defense and persistently maintained his innocence. He took an ethics-based tack. Berggren claimed that he was simply being a zealous advocate for his clients and that he did nothing wrong. He engaged in tough litigating, and he attacked the credibility of people testifying against him. Berggren spent days cross-examining Young, and he was trying to damage his credibility. Berggren also claimed that the witnesses on the drug charges were facing charges of their own, so they threw him under the bus to save their own behinds. The key witness, Berggren claimed, was accused of serious drug crimes himself, and he was hoping to get a lighter punishment by testifying against the lawyer. Berggren also claimed that the witness changed his testimony several times. Another part of his defense is that he tried to attack the government evidence. At the trial, the prosecution played the recordings of Berggren trying to hire the hitman to rub out Junior the Panamanian. Berggren, however, claimed that he knew the hitman was a fake and that he only played along with the guy's offer in the hopes of making some legal fees off of him. Berggren didn't just attack the prosecutor's evidence, he attacked the prosecution as well. Berggren said that the federal government was after him. His argument was that Berggren had the dime on officials for their actions at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. They knew it, Berggren claimed, and they set him up as a result. Berggren even tried to subpoena Dick Cheney and Donald H. Rumsfeld, the vice president and defense secretary at the time. Finally, as part of his defense, Berggren made a last-ditch effort. He tried to use his former relationship with the prosecutor, Paul Fishman. He claimed that Fishman had a vendetta against Berggren because he and a bunch of his other former colleagues were still angry that Berggren testified for the defense in that criminal case against the Essex County investigators back in 1991. He claimed they'd been after him ever since. Berggren's trial took 8 weeks. Berggren ended with a 3.5-hour closing statement. He denied doing everything the prosecution alleged. He asked the jury for forgiveness. He spoke about the shame he felt, and he claimed that all of his actions were simply the acts of a lawyer who was zealously advocating for the interests of his clients. He insisted that he was simply acting as the protector for people who didn't have a voice. When it came to those clients, Berggren explained, quote, "I get caught up with them, their families, their anguish. You try to work tirelessly and endlessly, as if they're your own children, as if they're your own family. I try to be there for the downtrodden, for the underdog, for the destitute, to show the client and the people that they have somebody who is willing to stand up for them." The jury didn't buy any of it. They deliberated for less than 2 full days and convicted Paul Berggren on all counts. 23 counts, including the murder of a federal witness, witness tampering, promoting prostitution, and trafficking in cocaine. The prosecutor and Berggren's former colleague Paul Fishman called it a stunning fall from grace. After U.S. District Judge Dennis M. Kavanaugh imposed sentence, Paul Fishman had this to say about Berggren, quote, "Each criminal choice he made was a step toward life in prison. After all he did to elude punishment for his clients, including orchestrating the murder of witnesses, he could not avoid facing justice for his own crimes." Paul Berggren received 6 life sentences and more than 200 years of prison. Since there's no parole in the federal system, Berggren will spend the rest of his life behind bars. In June of 2017, Paul Berggren was also permanently disbarred from the practice of law.